Welcome to Daily News Weekly, where we highlight the stories from the past week that you might have missed. I am your host, Michael Sheridan, and you may have noticed I am not in the studio. That's because for work reasons, I was working from home today, and I had to shoot the show, so I decided, what the heck, I'd do it in my backyard. And we're outside, it's raining, it's very humid, so let's get on with the show. Getting a driver's license in New York State just got a whole lot easier for undocumented immigrants. The state has passed a law allowing illegal immigrants to obtain a license to operate a motor vehicle legally. This makes New York one of a dozen states that allow this. Undocumented immigrants can also obtain a driver's license in Washington, D.C. So why did the state do this? Well, the argument for people who think that's a good idea is that it means that undocumented immigrants, since they're likely going to drive anyway, will at least know how to do it. They'll have to be trained, they'll have to know how to operate a vehicle, and they'll know the traffic laws. The other part of it is it would also get them to get car insurance. The other side of this is that it's just giving undocumented immigrants a sense of a form of identification, something they could use potentially to do other things that they otherwise wouldn't be allowed to do. There's also the argument that, they're making certain rules for undocumented immigrants while not having those rules for citizens, and that's not really fair. I think there's an argument maybe that can go both ways, but I think ultimately the idea here is to make roads safer for everybody. And that's why a certain amount of states have actually passed this kind of law. But what do you think? Should undocumented immigrants get a driver's license? Speaking of driving, a 4-year-old in Minnesota took his great-grandfather's SUV out for a spin to get some raisins. This is Sebastian, and the young boy was home with his great-grandfather when he got the need for the sweet treats. So he used the elderly man's walker to reach the car keys and took off in his Hyundai Santa Fe. Now, apparently this kid drove through his neighborhood, went on a 4-lane roadway to get to a Speedway gas station in order to pick up the raisins. That was about a 1.5-mile drive, which doesn't sound like a big distance, but truthfully, it's pretty far for a 4-year-old who can barely reach the pedals. Now, apparently, other drivers reported the erratic driving of this kid, and cops were at the gas station ready to pick him up, and they were shocked to find it was just a 4-year-old kid behind the wheel. And I wish the story could say that he actually drove well and did a great job, but unfortunately, he didn't. Apparently, he hit a bunch of mailboxes and clipped a tree. Now, I imagine the parents were terrified, and I would be too. It's frightening to even think about the idea of a little kid being behind the wheel like that. I don't even want to think about what would have happened if one of my kids did that. But you gotta give the kid some credit. I mean, that's ambition, to just get behind the wheel of a car like that, pull out. I think it's impressive. Since we had a little bit of a theme of driving-related stories this week, I'm going to bring it to a close with a rather gruesome story out of Tennessee. A routine traffic stop turned into a horrifying discovery when an officer found a severed torso inside a man's vehicle. Cops pulled over Dorade Johnson after he failed to stay in his lane on Interstate 40, according to the Knoxville News-Sentinel. As an officer approached his car, he took off. A chase ensued, which ended when Johnson crashed into a utility pole. Now, Johnson apparently has a history of drunk driving and had recently been busted back in January for a DUI. But this did nothing to prepare police for what they found in his car. Cops say that after the chase was over, they discovered the severed torso of 65-year-old Darrell Eugene Butler on the floor in the passenger seat of the car. Now, it isn't very clear exactly how the human remains ended up inside the car. It's not clear if Johnson maybe put it in there, or did the torso end up in the car after it was hit. Now, authorities said that Johnson did appear drunk at the time, but he wasn't actually charged with drunk driving. He does, however, face several other charges, including vehicular homicide, evading arrest, and driving while license revoked. Researchers have found that the rate of suicides in the United States has dramatically increased in the last few years. But what has the most concern is the increase among teenagers. Now, between the years of 2000 and 2007, the rate of suicide among teens ages 15 to 19 had remained relatively stable. But in 2017, there was a dramatic increase. Now, to use some numbers here, in the year 2000, the suicide rate among teens ages 15 to 19 was 8 per 100,000 people. In 2017, it rose to nearly 12 per 100,000 people. Now, it's important to note a few things. One is that the increase in suicide rate has actually happened across the board in all age groups. Also, researchers can't necessarily specify what is causing the increase. One possibility is that the increased use of social media, which would make the increase among teenagers a little more understandable. Another possibility is simply that the cause of death is being labeled as suicide in more cases because that's what the family is saying. Ultimately, researchers note that they really need to study the suicides more closely to better understand what is causing the increase. But what are your thoughts? What do you think is causing the rise in suicides in this country? A shop that sells flags and banners in Arkansas is calling it quits on selling a certain type of Confederate flag. A woman named Carrie McCoy runs the shop, which apparently has been operating out of Little Rock since at least 1975 and sells things online at flagandbanner.com. Now, she announced in a blog post that as of June 15th, her store will not be selling the Confederate battle flag anymore. Why? Because she argues that it has become a hate symbol. According to her post, she wrote, "My decision is not about the history and heritage of the rebel flag, but rather about how the flag is being used today." I find her argument interesting. I mean, the idea that it's being used today as if somehow that particular flag hasn't been used by hate groups for decades isn't happening. It's like she's only recognizing it now, which is admirable. And she does note that she'd seen an increase in sales of the Confederate battle flag in the last few years, when a lot of reports have been indicating that there's been an increase in white supremacy groups, more rallies, more protests, and of course the deadly Charlottesville incident. And at the same time, she's making this bold move, which I think is respectable, but she's also very clearly clarifying she is still selling a flag and banner of the Confederacy, the official flag and banner, which is not the same. It looks different. There's also something called the Blue Bonnie that she's also selling, which represents the Confederacy. What do you think? Do you think she's doing something brave and bold? Or do you think that maybe it's something that her and others probably should have done a long time ago? All right, that's the end of this outdoor episode of Daily News Weekly. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like button down below. Share this video with your friends, your family. Comment about the stories. Love to hear what you thought about the different issues and topics we talked about today. And now I think I'm ready to go back inside because I've been out here for a while. It's wet and raining and very humid. So humid that all of my pieces of paper are like really soggy just from the humidity. So that's it. I'll see you next week.